Welcome to today's webinar. It's AI versus AI, Learnings from the Frontier. I'm joined by the esteemed, the one and only, Gregor Stewart, who's SentinelOne's Chief AI Officer.
Hey, folks.
I'm Chris Hosking, Principal Evangelist for SentinelOne, and there's a lot that we want to get covered today, so let's get started. A few household items. There's a Q&A function. Please feel free to spam questions there. We've got moderators specifically there to answer your questions. There's also the ability to just drop a chat to everyone else that's watching this webinar, so maybe say where you're from. And then we've got some blogs that we've tagged and some other resources that we think are going to be relevant to this conversation. But what are we going to cover today? We're going to start with math, or maths, as I like to say it. A look into the difference between the positions of AI frontier labs versus governments. I know a lot of these organizations can seem like they're boundaryless, but they're often quite constrained by the countries under which they operate. Your view into operationalizing AI, and then we'll round out with a SentinelOne perspective on it all. So let's get started. AI math. I don't need to belabor this point. I think we're all well aware that fundamentally the math of cyber is changing because of AI. The cost that it takes to detect a vulnerability used in a defensive function has plummeted. Similarly, the cost to derive an autonomous run on an exploit has plummeted as well. We're now talking tens of dollars. This work that used to be highly specialized is now no longer. And I think we also can appreciate that for all of us building cyber budgets and programs, this might not have been a line item, but how to get the most out of frontier AI is a line item for this year or next. Do we invest in programs? Do we invest in products? Do we invest in setting aside talent to build our path towards how we leverage AI? And that's going to lead me to my very first question for Gregor. Through this presentation, I'm just going to keep pinging him with questions until he gets fed up with me. First of all, Gregor, you've been working in this AI space prolifically. Of course you have. This fundamental changing of the math of cyber because of AI, has this gone as you have expected it to have gone, or has it surprised you?
I've had three surprises, really, right? So the first one has been the level of capability for the kind of like median cost. So the average model now is so much more capable at a breadth of tasks, right, than I ever expected it to be. And then the second surprise is the speed of open weights advancement, right? So GLM, Kimi, all these models, right, have come along so quickly towards this Mythos level. I've had to revise my estimates about 3 times in the last 6 months of when we will see Mythos level capability in an open weights, setting. And I think the breadth of tasks is the last surprise for me, including binary analysis. I mean, this is something that even 6 months ago, you're happy to fund a separate company building binary analysis models, and now it's just a core capability of off-the-shelf models to be able to do reverse engineering and even just to find flaws in binaries. This is amazing.
For the folks watching, we're going to dive into the difference between open weights and open source a little bit later on, so I'm not going to quite rise to Gregor's bait just there, but please know that that's going to be a topic for us later on. But thank you for that, Gregor. We wanted to dive in. We don't want to explain what the world looks like to you. You're all in cyber teams. You know how AI is impacting you. So let's move straight on to the different labs that we're seeing and government response to it. From my perspective, I'm really seeing AI for defenders breaking into 3 different motions. Where are gate and verify programs? OpenAI and Anthropic are the ones that we're going to discuss, but please know that we expect others to deliver gate and verify programs quite shortly, which is selecting access to these frontier models being embedded into product, which is more of a philosophy of hey, defenders who use something, get the models into those workflows, which is where Sentinel-1 fits. And we're going to discuss our approach to where do we build native versus where do we partner with the market. And then there's the open source defense, the open weights approach to frontier models for defenders. So we're going to get started with OpenAI. There's a few things that I wanted to separate here because there's so many names and words and programs that go flying about, and it can be difficult to follow up with all of the 5.x that's in market. The Gate and Verify program, I think OpenAI has a very open response to this, which is they want to get their capability into as many defenders' hands as possible. So their most open model, their most open program for accessing their capabilities is the Trusted Access for Cyber, which is, hey, how can we get access to 5.5 under the Trusted Access for Cyber, which means less rejections, or fewer refusals, I should say, and then 5.5 Cyber specifically, as well as the next generation of models, 5.6, including Sol. This is about how do I access stuff that I won't otherwise get my hands on, or how can I perform tasks that might otherwise fail. This is not in contradiction or opposition to, but this is set aside from Daybreak. Daybreak is OpenAI's cyber program. It's for a platform approach, so it combines things like Codex for security, as well as then the Trusted Access for Cyber program that enables you to access everything. Daybreak is really the overarching platform and program. And so I wanted to talk about the difference between the two. Obviously, Sentinel-1 is a participant of Operation Daybreak, so we do have Trusted Access for Cyber to those models. Let's dive in. Gregor, you're at the forefront of using the latest models from OpenAI through the Daybreak program, through Trusted Access for Cyber. Could you talk to us about our own adoption and what we're hoping to deliver with access to these models?
So I want to differentiate two kinds of program, right? The first kind of program, like Daybreak, right, is for builders of very high blast radius products, and they have specific remits. Glasswing is similar, right? And the specific remit is scan and fix, right? This critical infrastructure. That's why we would be in these programs, and it's early access to the frontier within the labs, right? So both size and training regime. So 5.5 generically being a larger model, and 5.5 cyber being a specific cyber training regime, just like Mythos specific training regime, for example, right? And that's what we're charged to do, right? And to for as many as our customers who sit inside our boundaries, doing that same thing. And then there's a broader defender access, right? Where what you're trying to do is to make defenders capable with models that are not right at the boundary and super expensive, but that can be run at volume, right? So much broader, but less risky code bases, for example, right? That fewer people depend on, would be ideal for this. So if you're an enterprise company and you have your own, right, applications, you don't want to spend $1 million necessarily, scanning those, because they largely, they would affect you, right, rather than thousands of customers, tens of thousands of customers, right, necessarily. So there's a difference there. And just to give you the broad strokes of necessity, right, given their offensive capabilities, all models are guardrailed. Whether it's for bioweapon, processes or other such things as you want to make sure people aren't having easy access to. But so as well as being aligned, they're guardrailed, right? And in the TAC program and CBP, similar programs, right, the guardrails are removed and some access is given to these, cyber specific models. And that means that when you ask, hey, is there a malware here, it doesn't say, oh, malware, and then you immediately get bounced. And there was a little bit of a controversy, right, in that when Fable came out, it would bounce you to this lower grade model anytime you mentioned, right, anything, unless you were in this program. And so people had a strange experience there, right? So the labs are still kind of getting their act together, largely about, how to get the right people into the right programs and make sure people have access to the right models. And I think a bit of patience there is like paying dividends, right? As we employ it both for our own code base, right, and in our practice, frontier risk practice for customers.
Yeah, and it's worthwhile differentiating that for our audience today, that something like access to GPT 5.5 under TAC is separate from 5.5 cyber. You might want to use 5.5 TAC for your operational blue team work, validating, patching, validating, detection engineering as you're building out net new detections. Whereas that 5.5 cyber, that's the pointing yourself and shoot so that you can before someone else does, right?
And there is a price difference there. That's good for people to understand, right? The cyber models 5.5, that's at the kind of Mythos price level, and 5.5, standard in TAC is much cheaper.
Moving on to Anthropic now. Gregor mentioned the acronym CVP. You might have heard him call out in comparison to TAC, which is the Trusted Access for Cyber from OpenAI. That's the cyber verification program for Anthropic. That's, hey, how can I have access to as nearest to the edge models as possible if I can prove that I'm a defender? That's separate from, again, the overarching program for platform operators, those that manage open source software, those that are involved in critical infrastructure, and cybersecurity vendors themselves who have a high mandate to attack ourselves and look at ourselves. Similarly to Daybreak and TAC that SentinelOne has, SentinelOne is part of Glasswing. SentinelOne has CVP. I think where there's a broadening gap between the programs and the access. I know, Gregor, you wouldn't necessarily advise people try and get into Daybreak or get into Glasswing, but you would certainly talk about TAC and CVP for our customers?
I believe these are essential, for our customers, especially if they're trying to do their own, cyber hardening work, right? Resilience work. They need access to these, otherwise they just get too many rejections. I would say also, though, identifying yourself as a defender, right, is useful, right? Because in subsequent rounds, different models for different regimes, get access to the correct models without having to go back and ask. Like I said before, there are so many variants now, and maybe 2 or 3 generations operating in parallel, right? Different price points, different acuities for different tasks. It's worthwhile, being in those programs so that you have access without having to go ask specifically.
And please know that cost is something that we're going to cover explicitly a little bit later on. But those are the 2 major Frontier Labs approach to their Gate and Verify. Daybreak and TAC, Glasswing as the program, and the cyber verification program. So we highly recommend to you, seek out TAC if you're an OpenAI shop, seek out CVP if you're an Anthropic shop, or seek out both if you're indeed both. Something that we wanted to talk about was, how do these Frontier Labs go about determining what they want to gate? We've already seen slightly different philosophies. OpenAI certainly started with a let's give all defenders access. Anthropic started with let's give those managing massive software, massive open source. They've kind of met in the middle with their access programs, but they're grading themselves by their own scales. Anthropic has an approach to AI safety levels. They've talked about, when do we have a model that reaches the bar of deploying with care versus needing gates. They have another gate level, I should say, higher than that they haven't even defined yet, but they know that they will need to. Whereas OpenAI, their framework is more about, will adoption of this model fundamentally change net new pathways into cyber? Is it going to just amplify what we do already, or is it going to be unprecedented in new access? And they're trying to understand, how could their models, if used by attackers, materially uplift them? Gregor, given that these models are them grading themselves, that a model can only score as high as the test has it, is testing it to, and given that there's already evidence that these models know that they're being evaluated, what stock do you put into these evaluations and these levels? how should we view these levels in this framework as defenders?
Mm-hmm. So it's useful for the labs to raise to consciousness qualitative differences in model performance. And if they do so in a slightly exaggerated way, it's a little bit, you can see ASL as like BSL, like for biological threat and so on, right? But what they're trying to do in aping these same structures is bring to consciousness the possibility, right, of change. Because what's easy for people to do, out there in the world who are not like part of the frontier lab or constantly watching what they do, is to like miss a step change in capability, right? Especially in cyber, but more generally, right? I think the same was true for a long time in coding. People were still thinking, oh, they're just, auto-completion engines, when in fact they were already development partners, right? So although I would say, some of the fear that they generate and some of the talk here, I take you to task a little bit on some evidence that they know they're being evaluated. Well, they spit out sequences that, if a person was doing that would represent them knowing, right, that they were being evaluated. But it's much more like Dieselgate. It's much more like a right. A system realizes it's being benchmarked, right?
Yeah. That's fair.
So the real value is in raising the consciousness of enterprise actors and so on into like the genuinely qualitative difference in capability, right, of these much larger models.
No, very fair. That's it for what we wanted to cover in Gate and Verify. As I said, we covered OpenAI and Anthropic today. We're expecting more vendors to join this. We'll look out from xAI. We'll look out from Mistral shortly. We'll see what's what. But the next sort of main way in which Frontier Labs are getting their products into the hands of defenders is by embedding that capability where defenders are already working. Google Cloud has some phenomenal programs. I'm a big fan of what Big Sleep is doing in terms of identifying vulnerabilities. Claude Security Code in terms of how they're trying to do SAST and DAST work as you're working with as you're working in the environment to build out code. I think that's phenomenal. There's obviously a trade-off. There's potential to get locked into a stack if you're only using proprietary models from a single vendor. And that's something that we're going to have so much fun talking about a little bit later on, how SentinelOne's approach is getting you capability but not locking into a stack. But this is sort of the other main approach, is embedding functionality in. And then finally, open source, which is the rising tide lifts all boats approach, which has the obvious caveat of, if we're lifting capabilities for defenders, we may be lifting capabilities for offenders who can look at frameworks, who can look at programs, who can look at open weights, who can look at what's winning notable challenges. Meta's, of course, a big player in the space with Purple Llama and CyberSec Eval 4. But I also wanted to call out DARPA's challenge, which is the AI Cyber Challenge, where they invite multiple groups to present their frameworks if they're successful on what they've built with open weights environments. I'd be keen, Gregor, for your take on where you think this balance is working for the public. And whether this is leaning left or right.
Right. So the proliferation of benchmarks is helpful in this cyber space to understand like the development of capabilities. One unfortunate consequence of kind of like relentless pursuit of advantage is that any benchmark that is static, right, or has bits that can be memorized, right, is tending to be like quickly overrun or saturated, as they say, and so we're moving into an era of benchmarks being essentially dynamic ranges and so on. And this actually is quite costly to build and maintain, right? It's a lot of compute, right, to have something that mutates enough, right, to keep a large model on its toes. And so you're seeing AISI in the UK and others, right, producing more robust tests, right, at the scale. And so I think that also allows open weights and others, right, to start like building those capabilities in a way that perhaps was only accessible to these large labs, with their partnerships and so on. Right?
And that's a perfect segue into where should these frameworks lie? Should it lie with the organizations themselves and in forums that they share, or should it be driven by per legislation and by the governments? I know a lot of us think of these organizations as being international. They are in execution, but they're not in terms of home. And they're certainly not in terms of tax, and they should all pay more tax, as an aside. But we wanted to cover the direction that the governments are moving in terms of AI governance. Now, the United States has recently run an executive order. They're quite clear about their approach is, let's get everyone access where possible. Let's not hold the industry back. They have created a benchmarking process that NSA is going to lead, which is, where is a frontier model considered a covered frontier model that needs to be watched? But it's an entirely voluntary program. It's voluntary to give them 30 days access. CISA is delivering directives on how this clearinghouse will be built to deliver all of the frontier model capabilities to critical infrastructure, but it's certainly not a slow down your horses. It's a let's be sure we know what's going on, which is certainly an interesting reflection given that a lot of us saw, those of us not living in the US, a big US stamp on not having access to Fable. Mm-hmm. Europe up next, they've certainly got a well-documented approach to the kind of governance that they want. Europe's always long been careful. For them, their AI cyber action plan through ENISA is about what are we going to accept, what are we not going to accept. And that kind of mirrors the work that they've done with the EU AI Act, which is about where is AI infringing upon human rights. In comparison, the UK's approach to AI and frontier labs is kind of being driven by the same kind of approach that they have anything post-Brexit, which is how can we deliver something that the rest of the world is going to love, which is how can we have collaboration, how can we institute evaluations but not slow anything down. So it's how can we try and foster partnership and eyes on. And then finally, we've got the Asia Pac. Korea, I genuinely believe, is kind of leading the world in a lot of AI governance framework. They recently put into law framework to be running AI red teaming on government organizations and private organizations. If we go back to the last slide of the AI Cyber Challenge, it was a South Korean team that won that last year. And then Singapore and Australia have taken a similar approach to the UK, which is let's watch, let's collaborate. Whereas India's got a little bit more structure for opportunities to say no. But Gregor, I know that you're in the field. You're talking to organizations that run across geographies. Is there any particular jurisdiction that stands out to you as leading the way?
Actually take a slightly different tack on this and saying that governance of novel and rapidly developing things is of necessity a journey, right? And functional measurement and characterization are essential components of this. And so I think insofar as all the jurisdictions are developing measurement methods and a diversity of measurement methods, for example, right? Like this is really helpful, right? So characterizing these, capabilities in order to be able to judge them by whatever standards you establish, right, is the main contribution at the moment. And the diversity of approaches in these different jurisdictions kind of guarantees, right, that we'll have multiple perspectives there. I think the EU is possibly in the trickiest spot, right? Its citizenry and, machinery value consistency, with prior practice over the, growth and innovation, let's say, drive that others can focus on, right, more concretely. So I would say the EU is probably taking a bullet, right, for the rest of the world and trying to hold the line, right, on that. And as a consequence, I think we'll gain, an interesting perspective.
Appreciate that. I think it's worthwhile understanding that there's certainly a bit of a shared understanding between the labs and the government of however stringent you want to be and how frequently we want to evaluate ourselves. We certainly need to evaluate the models for what they're capable of, access to them and their capability. And potentially we need to start generating programs on distribution, as we've seen with the gate and verify approach from OpenAI and Anthropic, and that guardrails are fundamental. We can't have these models doing anything that they like. We need to understand their use in real time, and we need to establish guardrails on their capability as they're out in the field. And for us, as we're deploying them, we need to look for where we can unlock them and where their locking is preventing us, and we might need a program. I've got a flag here on evaluate. SentinelOne is about to publish a piece of work that should help you evaluate the different frontier models. Gregor, and I don't want to spoil it. I don't want to talk about specifically the findings, but in advance of us sharing SentinelOne's evaluation of the frontier models for cyber tasks, as we publish that, how do you think defenders should leverage that body of work that body of research that we're about to release for evaluation?
First, I think it's going to open your eyes more so than the persistence required to chain attacks together, right? Which is, has been the headline of the Mythos era, to the depth and complexity of a task that we can automate within cyber, and how we can turn tokens into long-term defender advantage. And we're talking about reverse engineering. We're going to commit a new benchmark, right, to the community. I think it's both fascinating in itself, and it develops on the FAST16 work. What is it that you saw us publish recently? One last remark on that, I would say that the speed with which things can be done now is in itself a game changer, right? Although I don't love that phrase, in that things that defenders, could only dream, oh, well, if only I could do this, right, on all these things, right, are now possible. And that changes qualitatively my ability to track campaigns and so on and so forth. And so there's some really juicy material towards the end of that piece, which, hope everyone will read, in which we spell out those implications, right?
And please look out for our next webinar in this series. It's going to cover that material deliberately. You might have noticed all of the flags didn't have one in particular, putting or pulling China into the mix. On the right-hand side here, this is slightly old in terms of AI, because it's from April of this year, which is weird to say it's old. But this is an evaluation that NIST released of their thoughts on US versus Chinese models. Notably, the Chinese approach is a little bit more open weights than the US and international approaches. It's important to note, open weight does not mean open source. We have no visibility into the training data. We don't know what's been built in terms of ways, behavior and integrity of how to react to data in real time. But what we can see is performance, and what we can see is weights of how that will present itself to new tasks. And China's leading. Chinese models represent 60% of tokens routed through Open Router as of mid-2026. Qwen has passed more than 1 billion downloads. And we see US enterprises sending a significant portion, more than a third of their traffic to Chinese models. We're going to go back to open weights, so don't worry, that's not the end of the Chinese conversation, because we're also going to talk about data integrity. But let's move on to, we've talked about frontier models. How do we put these into use? Already we've discussed the difference between an access program that lets you use a frontier model to have defensive augmentation for yourself, in terms of how can you help use that model to do triage, enrichment of your alerts in real time, drafts and review playbooks, verify patching, and vulnerability management. That's separate to often the more gated and higher access that allows you to point that same functionality at yourself to find flaws. Gregor, I'd be keen for your view, not just of SentinelOne, but of the larger field that you've seen. Are you seeing these models best use when they're put to defensive capabilities or for offensive capabilities? Not in terms of what they're able to do, but in terms of what they're delivering to the teams that are using them.
Um, I, I think their best use at the moment, right, their kind of highest leverage is in defensive action, especially as deployed to do triage and those kinds of operational tasks, because we've been underwater, right? Most people have been underwater, whatever tools they use, for a long time. And then that scanning thing that everyone was encouraged to do, Mythos onwards, right, is essential, right, because it reduces the load, of effective attack, right, and so that defensive work is there. But in the next 6 to 12 months, it will pivot to this offensive self-testing, right, where we will use these models, and this is part of why we have CPP, TAC, and these frontier programs like Glasswing and so on, right, where we pivot into attacking code bases, application, and so on, to understand, right, vulnerability in a more nuanced way, in a more subtle way, right, and to start to build fixes. What is it that we can't get just from the code base, for example? So yes, now defensive a little bit, down the line, attack to defend, right, is the best use.
Yeah. Certainly, I think that's something that's at the moment worthwhile to let big platform players take care of. If you look at your own stack, the app that you might have created versus Microsoft as a threat surface, let Microsoft find all their bugs before you potentially look at your own stack, is certainly what I would say.
That's right. I think you need to demand from your upstream, providers the same thing you would do for your own code base, right?
Yeah. Interestingly, what I want to talk about next is how that might lead us into a bottleneck. I think AI is phenomenal at finding problems. A little bit of a harder use case is how can we leverage AI to find solutions? Because we don't want to get into this model where we become experts at finding all of the nightmare scenarios and not necessarily experts at increasing our capability to be resilient, or to respond in real time, or to learn from events as they happen. I don't want the queue to become the problem of the queue of everything to fix, rather than leveraging a frontier model to fundamentally change the speed at which we fix things. And that's my personal shout out to the defensive capabilities of, if we can speed up the way in which we review, verify, ensure that things are deployed safely, then I think we'll have a better time leveraging frontier AI than just pointing at ourselves. That's certainly something that we want to build in to understand all of the tasks that we're asking AI to perform within our cyber program. What architecture is going to suit us? What trust model is going to suit us? Where do humans have to be in the loop? And what cost are we happy with? So as we come to look at how do we kick off this workflow, you've always got these two main options of, do we embed AI into the capability as we're running something, or do we do one-off bounded engagements? I think you probably can already tell in which way the two of us are leaning, but it's an open question for our audience, which is, how do you go about weighing these two? How much work does it take to stand up a truly embedded program that's wiring frontier model capability into your SOC versus saying, hey, we're going to run a 3-week sprint and it's just going to be bounded to, let's say, vulnerability detection in a homemade app? Gregor, is there a side that you're leaning to, or advice? You've certainly seen a lot of these projects.
Yeah, I think it starts with one-off, right? Where you're, again, in this preparatory phase, let's call it that, right? For fully agentic attack modes, we need to be doing as much as we can to shore up code bases, applications, and so on. And the embedded part is somewhat enabled by the fact that most of us are adopting these new tools, for software development, right? So as we're moving into Claude Code, Codex, and we're putting more of our capability into Scales, and we're shifting many more things left, right, by having multiple agents look at, right, the code as we're writing it for these different qualities, and employing things like Expo continuously on our applications, right? You don't have to necessarily build an embedded capability. It's more or less being provided to you, right, as you're transitioning from one mode of software development, one mode of application development, one mode of infrastructure development, right, to the successor one, right. So in a way, use the products that are prevalent, and you're going to get quite a lot of the embedded capability. But right now, if you have areas of concern, you're probably best running these one-off projects at least to minimize your upfront load.
Given that there's certainly a cost associated with running those projects and furthermore running them embedded, I also wanted to just cover the conversation of frontiers not always required. Gregor's already cracked into that a little bit of like, hey, the higher models cost a lot of money. Don't use all that money on things that a lower model could achieve. I think we need to start placing what capability does the task that we have require in terms of model, because that's going to sit on a cost scale as well. Certainly, if we then reflect upon our Chinese cousins, there's often a cost consideration from that angle, which is probably driving that adoption, where many people are reporting much lower token usage from Chinese open weight models. But I also want to talk about the fact that beyond the bleeding edge not necessarily being needed, there's a difference between the size of these models, which then impacts where you can run the models. Gregor, I'm going to be asking you about running models locally, but even before I ask you about running models locally, I want to talk about cost first. Mm-hmm. I know you've got a couple of models that you're fans of that achieve tasks at, in the lower ranges if it's highly bounded and rule driven. Could you expand on that a little?
Sure. I think the thing that I want our kind of listeners to focus in on is that the tricky part of deciding which model for which task is fast being kind of taken off your plate, right? So sure. There are many model routers or gateways, and there are many mechanisms that are being provided by Anthropic and OpenAI to, if you can provide task specification or you can run a log of tasks and their success, can figure out which models to route things to autonomously without having to, have the expertise to decide, which goes to which. And you can track that cost curve at least somewhat, right? Using these emerging mechanisms. That's certainly what we do ourselves. And what we see is that, so for instance, in terms of investigation, for example, which is something that we released and, we now use as part of our inner loop, right, for our next generation SOC products, that much smaller models can handle most of the cases. And we'll talk a little bit about what that means in terms of, cost profile. But just to say open weights models like Gemma 4 and others, which are very far from frontier, right, are incredibly capable now in a way that even, a year and a half ago, they weren't a very, these open weights models weren't a great basis for this work. Right? So.
And so now let's add on the dimension of running them locally. What's the benefit of having smaller models that you can run locally?
Mm-hmm. So the first one is enablement, right? Smaller models are the only game in town, right? For some execution venues, like phones and so on. And it's not just size, physical like footprint, right? Phone only has so much RAM and it only has so much memory, right? SSD, let's say. And it can also be compute bound, right? So, a smaller model requires fewer, transistors to run, and you can get a certain kind of level of output. And there's many techniques to make models fit and be lower compute. And the second one is speed of response. If the model is where the action is happening, and the reckoning is being done there, response can be in the same time frame as the offense. Right, and you've seen us with our rollback capabilities and so on. If we can catch attack patterns in that moment rather than going to the cloud, we can remediate right there and then. Cost reduction, obviously, fewer cycles, less RAM. And customers are very tight on the kind of resource limit they'll give us. If it goes above 2% CPU, they may turn it off, and then they're less protected. Right. Lastly, it's about minimization of surface. Right, a model that does less is less risk, right? And so tuning a model can be as much about avoiding introducing new vulnerabilities as it can be, optimizing cost and so on.
Just another, it's a +1 shout out there. It's worthwhile understanding the difference between execution from a security standpoint on device versus a cloud lookup. That might sound trivial. Where's the intelligence kicking in? In terms of speed, the potential for an attack to proliferate and spread and to spawn up processes within the cloud around lookup versus being responded to mitigation happening on device because of on-device AI, it's the difference between attacks being stopped or not at the speed that they're currently developing. When we looked at, attack landscapes of breakout happening measured in 40 minutes, hour and a half, cloud lookups that take 3-4 minutes, 5 minutes, that's fine. As we're looking at the speed of AI now, on devices needed. But I'll shut up because that's a whole other topic, which I'm very happy to talk about, but we're not going to talk about now. So let's talk about risk. I'm going to divide into two halves. When we're dealing with AI, or not even just the frontier, but AI in general, there's the risk of where is my data going? I know for many that's why Chinese models are considered haram. The national intelligence law obviously enables Chinese organizations to share data with the government. That being said, running those open weights models locally does remove that risk. But when you're dealing with any model, you've got to understand where is your data going, how is it being used. The other risk is if you don't understand how a model is being trained, you don't necessarily understand how it's going to react. I'm going to go into the world of the hypothetical now, but say we're using a model from a country that likes to attack others. If you were to ask that model, look at these tactics, these techniques, these IP ranges, do they look like a specific threat actor that belongs to the country of Wakanda? It might say no, to do a little Marvel reference there. But these are what's front of mind when it comes to which models we should pick. And we should note here that running locally does not remove the risk of not necessarily understanding the integrity and behavior of models. And then finally, to just wrap up our section on routing between models and local models, Gregor already talked about this. It's really worthwhile understanding not just what tasks you have, what models you need, but how you're going to route work. There's been phenomenal work published that already demonstrates ensuring the right capability for the right tasks does not reduce quality of your overall outcome, but it does reduce cost often. So I would certainly say for many, routing tasks to the right model is going to be incredibly necessary. It's also a lot of work. If you've got 1 or 2 people in your security team, you might not be able to build out a sophisticated router for different tasks. And that's somewhere where SentinelOne is really interested in helping out. And so with that being said, let's talk about the SentinelOne perspective on all of this. We're not going to sit on this too long, but I think you know that SentinelOne follows the embedded route. How can we leverage our own homegrown models as well as best of breed AI and AI in the traditional old sense of AI and ML to help people on a path of how can they build their way towards the autonomous SOC. I'm not going to cover what you're seeing on the slide here, but I will say that Gregor has published a phenomenal blog recently about his own reflections to 18 months since we published this model originally, and his view of the path towards the autonomous SOC. What I will say is that we've put a lot of investment into ensuring that from a SentinelOne perspective, we choose the right model for the right job. On the top right of the screen, you might, if you squint, see the reference architecture that we have for Purple AI, which is our autonomous SOC analyst. We deeply believe in different models having different strengths at different times, needing the flexibility to adopt new models as they come on, as well as we deeply believe in our own ability to develop models that deliver security outcomes. Gregor, you've been a part of this. How do we choose between what we build ourselves versus what to outsource?
So we think about privacy of our customers for ourselves. We think about inner loop versus outer loop. Your previous slide where you're saying things that happen at very high cardinality all the time, like investigation, it's central, to SOC operations. And so if you have something that happens a million times, you're much more likely to want to optimize that element of it, right? And so that's an opportunity. And then just quality and specificity of function for size. So, if we can incorporate, a number of functions in a single model and still be smaller than the engines it replaces, we will do that. So a number of things cause us to, either select a particular model or build our own. And one last thing to say is that every time we make use of a model, every, execution venue we put them in, ZDR is our watchword. All of our third parties in all of our jurisdictions, right? We ensure that we have that, and that our customers know, which models and which providers we use.
Thank you for that, Gregor. For those of you that may not have seen yet, I do want to draw a little bit of attention to where I think we're leveraging AI in an incredibly interesting way, which is our recent release of Purple AI Agentic Investigation, which is essentially an agentic SOC workflow. Previously, we had the ability for analysts to kick off investigations themselves, and then we'd have that agentic investigation happen. They would then validate, and then potentially they built a workflow that would automate it. Now what we're seeing in the trial of Purple AI Agentic Investigations, which is open right now, it's been open for a little, half a month?
Mm-hmm.
3 weeks?
Yeah.
This trial is brand new, but jump on while it's hot. How do we have triggers to set up automatic agentic investigations, so that there are preset classes where those investigations are going to happen automatically to deliver a verdict to you. And you can then look at that verdict and say, hey, I'm going to follow along. Would I have made the same investigations as the AI has? Do I absolutely disagree and it's dumb and I'm smarter? Or yes, I love the results that it's found. Do I agree with the true positive or the false positive? Do I want to direct it towards a workflow? Or do I have preset policies for if there is a true positive to take certain action? Like, for example, yes, it is a true positive on ransomware. I do want to roll back if that environment is just employees or crypto mining, and I do want to forward that IP to a firewall, for example. But I would say big shout out to Purple AI Agentic Investigations. Check this trial out because it's incredibly interesting.
I wanted to give you one thought about that, Chris. One thought about that, the agentic investigations. In the first week, we think about how much labor we're saving customers, right? And in the first week, our kind of like annual labor saving rate was about $5 million. And, this 3 weeks in, we're already at like $36 million of labor saved, right? For customers who've been in the trial, on an annual basis. I think pretty soon we're going to hit that sort of 100 million a year, right? Saving for our customer base, and it's an actual real saving that you would otherwise spend time, doing, right? You can move that expertise to something, of greater value, proactive work.
Thank you, Gregor. As a flag overall, I just want to point out that there's been debate over whether the autonomous SOC exists in the future or not. Can we get there? Certainly, we're not saying it's a thing that you can buy. It's about how can we build capability? How can we be on that motion towards it? But I wouldn't necessarily ask ourselves, what decisions do we want to be autonomous or not? How autonomous can we make things? It's more, we have phenomenal expertise in cyber within each of our programs across all of our organizations. How do we keep control over decisions that matter? How can we ensure human governance over AI action? And so I think SentinelOne's got an incredible focus on how can we help organizations build relevant control as we achieve autonomous outcomes to security. In terms of how you achieve that, I don't want to spend too long because I'm already cognizant that we're running a little bit long, but it's not just clicking a button. I think we need to set up a crawl, walk, run process, which is, hey, let's understand how agents are helping us in real time, whether it's Purple AI agentic investigations or whether it's something that you've homegrown or embedded product elsewhere. Validate that work in real time against your judgment. Find candidates to automate a reaction or a response or remediation to a verdict that agent delivers, and then test that out. That's the walk. Look at the accuracy across a set period of time, find where something's gone wrong, and then look at more avenues to expand that out. More workflows of, yes, we believe in how agents are delivering our, let's say, understanding of triage, or in our instance, Purple AI agentic investigation. Understand where that human should sit. Should they just build workflows and make sure that they flow, or do they need to be the ones that click approve every single time? And this is going to be different for different workflows, but I just wanted to introduce this model. And as a final note, it's just worthwhile knowing that I genuinely don't believe you need new people to do this, but we do need to understand that as we adopt AI within the SOC, we're changing the way in which we're approaching engineering and architecture and management. Detection engineering is about, hey, how can I build out detection as code loops? Not just detection as code, but detection as code loops. Threat intel is about how can I translate what I see from the field and what I get from threat intel into detection logic. Senior analysts are going to be about, hey, what do I understand about my environment to use that to hunt hypotheticals? And junior analysts are going to be about, how do I validate what I've gotten from the machine rather than doing that 90 minutes of work myself? But let's wrap things up. I think what you've seen us talk through today is about genuinely, and people are always a little bit surprised that I'm happy with this, because I love talking about attacks so much that they're a little bit surprised when I'm happy for defenders, which I apologize for. But I genuinely believe the weight on the asymmetry is leaning back towards defenders in terms of what AI can give us. I think you need to focus on the basics to start with, which is not necessarily point frontier AI at your environment, but at your capacity to be resilient and to remediate. Have them earn their place. We need to have attention towards what model is right for what job. We need to consider buy versus build. Obviously, we've got a Sentinel-1 hat on, so it's a little bit obvious which way we're swaying there, but I will generally and genuinely say that with SOC teams being as busy as they are, they can't put aside a month and a half to evaluate and build the new architecture for, hey, what is this that we're going to vibe code ourselves? It's, if we're using something already, how can we increase the line of assistance to autonomy in real time as we're working through alerts? And then finally, of course, it's verify what you run. But as we wrap up, we are at the close. Gregor, I wanted to hand it back to you. We've been chatting for 55 minutes. Anything else that you'd like to add? Any final things that you wanted to respond to?
I think a closing remark might be, for everybody listening, to maximize their understanding and capacity to use these technologies. The asymmetry here could flip, right? You know, if we are not assiduous and focused, right, in figuring out how to maximize the value of these defensively. And Mythos and GPT-5.6 have ushered in qualitatively different capabilities. And I think it's easy to not get a good practical understanding of those yourself. So that the value here is you've had a step change, understanding it for yourself, having your own hands, working with partners, right? Like Sentinel-1. But go out, understand as much as you can, and build capacity within your organizations to use it.
Thank you, Gregor. We talked about it earlier. We will be helping you with that evaluation by showing our own view of Sol versus, Sol versus Mythos preview, or what are we versing Sol off?
Oh, everything versus everything. We have we have four
We'll see it
8,
come out.
5-5 cyber, 5-6. It's a all versus all. Right.
All right. SentinelOne is shortly going to publish Hunger Games of Frontier AI in the cyber use cases. We'll do another webinar for that. Thank you so much for our audience. Thank you for your questions. We've seen them come in. We've seen the moderators respond to those. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.